Hi, everyone. It's really great to see you. And just so you know what I'm seeing on my side, I've got all your faces are over there. So if you see me looking off this way, it's because I'm actually probably trying to look at you, as impersonal as that seems. Um, and we have just under an hour, so I'd love to jump in and to try to make as much time as possible for like chat questions to come in or for other kinds of questions to come in because the value of any of this, I think, has to do with its applicability to the realities that you're facing in your own teaching scenarios. So let's jump in. My name's Tom Lynch, and I was an English teacher and ed tech coach at a school as well. I directed a large-scale online learning initiative in the New York City Public Schools, and then helped design the digital resource repository space for New York City teachers called We Teach NYC. And then I was an ed tech professor for over 7 years, and now I've pivoted now to start to do a bit more on the policy side of the work, and also with engaging parents in New York City to try to help them help their children and teachers support their schools. I also continue to do a great deal of work at the intersection of computer science and the teaching of English, especially in secondary settings. And while that's not the focus of this presentation today, I'll share a little bit about that later on in the context of what it means to teach literature in remote and blended environments. Okay, so let's see. Perfect. So what should you expect? Well, we're going to talk a little bit about the why. Like, why should we be using technology in the English classroom at all is a fair question. And then we'll get into the how. And again, we hope to have plenty of time for Q&As as well. So why technology in ELA? Well, there's a few reasons that might not seem so obvious at first. So one is that the actual etymology of the word technology is techne, and techne had everything to do with the use of materials in like crafty ways, like creating shields and things like that. But then over time, it also became a word that was used to describe the way that people would use words to deceive each other. So the etymology of the word technology is like very much linguistic, and it's in like the ELA teachers camp, if you ask me. The idea of writing in the classroom is also famously described as like the technologizing of the word, because you're going from like oral spoken language to using an instrument in order to capture representation of that oral language. And so Walter Ong once described it as the technologizing of the word. So the etymology tells us tech belongs in the ELA classroom. The nature of writing tells us that technology belongs in the English classroom. The nature of books themselves are a technology. The idea that you have this like a kind of concrete instrument and representation of language and communication. That's the result of technologies, yes, so in the form of writing, but then the book itself is also described as a form of technology. And finally, when we talk about the word digital, even in this digital age, the idea of the digital, that you have software and things like that, all of that is powered by languages, by human and computational languages. Like, that's what it means to be digital. So even when we're talking about the digital age, which seems sometimes like it might be in conflict with the way I teach writing or the way I teach reading, the fact is even the nature of the word digital has everything to do with language, because it's actually a linguistic construct. So with those 4 points in mind, let's just get a little bit more of now like kind of a macro view of what it means to teach English. There's also a tropical storm like coming through my area, or the remnants of it. So if you hear any sort of thunder, winds, or like very loud rain on a window, don't worry, I'm fine. Unless it all goes black, in which case, watch my Twitter account for updates. This is a picture of my son reading in a library. He's not quite the devout reader that I'm hoping for yet, but he's getting there day by day. But this is just to put a little bit of context in terms of who we are as a profession. So there's almost 300,000 English teachers, ELA teachers in the United States, about 70,000 English professors. There's about 56.5 million students who are in K-12, and about 20 million students who are in 13 through 16. That is going into in college and undergrad. So when we're talking about who we are as a field, like, we're big. We're a big field, and we're compulsory. So not only are we, are we this large in size, but it's also we're a required subject most of the time for the vast majority of students going through K through 16 education. So we've got some chops, we've got some clout. But there's also something on the on the horizon right now that we also kind of have to acknowledge, which is the obvious, which is that everybody's being thrust into these online settings. These are t-shirts from teachers.inc, and you'll see that one says, "I miss my classroom," "I miss my classroom," "I miss my classroom." One has an online learning in progress shirt, which I should be wearing perhaps now. Online teacher established 2020, proudly. And then you've got beers at the end of a single day, perhaps morning, depending on how you choose to live your life. But after teaching online, so we're also facing a really unprecedented just scenario in the coming months and year, really. So with all of that context in mind, we're going to start to transition now into a few main sort of principles and start to get it's starting broad, as you might have noticed, right? And now we're going to start doing this. And then the goal is to get here where I'm hearing real questions from you and looking at some real examples of things, okay? Before we transition into that, this is our workshop doc. You can go to this document right now. If you're on a computer, it's easiest perhaps to take your phone and just snap the QR that's on your screen. It'll take you right to the open document. You can also go to tll.fyi/y'all, like hi y'all, and that will take you to the same document. So what I've done there is I've created an open Google Doc, which I can actually show you on the screen. And I can see a bunch of you are logging in now. We've got over a dozen folks on it. And what I'm going to ask you to do is you can just grab one of these lines here, one of these rows. You could put either your actual first name is fine, or if you want to use a pseudonym, that's fine too. It's open, so it's not like you didn't have to log in or anything. But what this does is it provides a collective space for us to capture what you're hearing, and then also what are some of the things that you're wondering throughout as well. Okay, and then later on, I'm going to do some demo work, and we'll do it right below here. So if you need to find the document throughout, you can always, you can just go to tll.fyi/y'all. You can also raise your hand in the chat, and if you put it out to everyone, I'm sure others would jump in with a reminder of it. But we'll come back to this document throughout, but you're welcome to write into it at any time, okay? All right, moving on. So we've talked a little bit about why using tech already, but there's a few other things to just think about. I've done a great deal of work at the intersection of technology and learning and teaching and leading over the last 17 years, I guess. And one of the things that I see over and over again is overload. It's the idea that there's constantly a new product coming out. There's constantly some new thing that I can do, and then when I try it in my classroom, it falls apart on me sometimes, and it can be very hard to manage. There's also sometimes the overwhelmingness at feeling like our students know more than we do about the technologies we're using, which I found is actually not often as true as it seems. They can be great at using the tech for their own kind of narrow purposes, but when it's, just because a student can write a note and pass it to another student in class doesn't mean they can write an essay or do something deep and critical with it. Having a certain level of comfort alone isn't enough to make sure they're learning with it. So I was really honored a couple of years ago to co-lead a committee at the National Council of Teachers of English that focused on renovating a belief statement for integrating technology into the English language arts. And you can find that right now by, again, you could snap the QR code that's in front of you on this slide, or you could also go to tll.fyi/beliefs, and that will take you to the belief statement. As I'm saying these things too, and if you're quick and comfortable on Zoom, and if you're able to chat and add it to the group chat, you can also do that so other folks can just jump on the link. That would be a little too much for me to try at the moment. But let's just go through some of them. There's really 4 main principles here that I think can be very grounding and very useful. Also, we've heard from many teachers who are in the field that this kind of document is super useful when you're trying to, one, get ideas for how to approach tech in the classroom, but also when you're trying to have a conversation with an administrator about why you're trying to do the thing that you're doing. Citing a document like this has also been has been very useful. So the first main principle is that when we're thinking about technology in the English classroom, literacy means literacies, plural. So it's the idea that the traditional notion of what it means to read and write is becoming more pluralized. It means that the ways in which we can make meaning are exponentially growing. So whether it's about taking digital photographs, or it's about using audio, if it's about creating video, The idea of like traditional literacy has been stretched and deepened and expanded into literacies, plural. And there's a ton of work around all of that. We get into a lot of detail in the actual document. So if any of this is of interest to you, just check out the doc. You'll love it, I think. The next main principle that we then tried to focus on was this idea that like literacies, plural, notice plural, literacies has to come before the technologies. So again, sometimes when it's, and you're seeing this happen all throughout the country right now, is when there's, especially when there's a sense that like we have to do something. So whether it's like we got these iPads and have to do something with them, or the entire school system is going online and none of us are really sure what to do. The instinct can be to like jump to the technical solutions as quickly as possible, right? And there's no shortage of technical solutions out there, right? Everybody's got something to sell at this moment. But what we have to do is you've got to step back and say like, what are the actual literacies practices that I'm envisioning here? What's important from an ELA, unabashed ELA perspective? Like what's important for my students to learn here, or for me to learn with them? And then what are the technologies that we can use to make that happen? That is like the strict order of things. And if we put the technologies first, and there's a lot, and the people will tell you to, or people will do it, but if you put the technologies first, more often than not, it's like heartache at the end of that road. So put literacies before technologies. Next, we talk about what it means to consume and produce texts anew. So earlier we talked about the notion of literacy, meaning literacies, plural. There's all of these, it's not just reading and writing in the way that I think about it. It's composing maybe. It's like these other kinds of things I can do. It's remixing, these are all of this other stuff. But then also it's this is a broader notion that what constitutes a text and what constitutes what it means to create and produce a text. We want to think anew about what those possibilities are. So, you know, is it that it isn't just about writing the essay? It's about it's about creating some sort of remix, or is it not about just completing a one of the traditional sorts of like tests or assignments you might have, but thinking more broadly about what are the kinds of texts that can actually be produced here by students, that can be consumed by students. How much am I integrating video and audio into the kinds of text that I'm even presenting to my students with my students to share? So this idea of consuming and producing text anew is another core belief. And finally, technologies are not neutral. So, and we won't get into this a ton, but let me just say that sometimes we have a way of talking about digital technologies like with objectivity and neutrality, right? That it's like, oh, well, we're using, we're going to use whatever it might be, Snapchat, or we're using Twitter in the classroom, or we're using this, Brain Pop, right? Whatever it might be, however you want to define it. But what you have to remember is that, like, it's not a pencil that you have in front of you. Like, these technologies are created by large groups of other people, and those other people have assumptions about the world. Those other assumptions have deeper or more shallow understandings of what constitutes learning and teaching. And all of that gets encoded like into the actual technologies you're using. So have you ever had a tool you might be trying to use in the classroom, and you're like, oh, I wish it would just do ... Like, the reason it doesn't do ... isn't because it couldn't have been created to do it. It's because whoever created it didn't think of putting that particular functionality in there. There are human beings behind these technologies. So listen out for the way in which we sometimes approach tech with like more of a neutral understanding, and just remember that they're really not neutral. They could have been designed so many other ways. All right. Oh, there we go. So what I'm going to run through now are just, these are like, the way I like to think about this is like, what are the simplest, most high leverage forms of technology to focus on, and then uses of those technologies in the classroom. It is not about trying to find every latest, greatest thing to dazzle everybody. Like, that's not the point. The point is to say, like, what are the simplest, most high leverage tools I can use and get really, really good at and comfortable with, so that maximize like my students' learning and that make my teaching most efficient. That's how I go into it. And there's no shortage of ed tech bloggers out there who are covering like the latest, greatest tools that are coming out. But I have found that tends not to lead to the greatest practice, nor does it tend to be sustainable over time. So if I had to create my collection of like what's in my simple satchel of like ed tech tools, like honestly, these are some of the most useful for me. And some of them are self-explanatory, some of them aren't, and then we're going to dive in a little more deeply. So first, you've got Google Docs. Many schools are using Google or something similar, Microsoft, right? But these collaborative applications for writing, for creating presentations, etc. Google Docs alone, there's so much you can do with just that. And I'm going to show you some tricks that I've refined with working with teachers over the years. Slides as well can be used phenomenally. Screencasting is one that if you haven't gotten comfortable with it, it's something I highly, highly, highly recommend. So all screencasting refers to is just where you're recording what you're doing on your screen and you're narrating it at the same time. So it's kind of like the Khan Academy video sort of thing. It's like I'm looking at someone's screen and they're talking to me while I'm watching their screen. These tools are like so underutilized and they're so invaluable, especially for online and remote learning. And finally, there's some data tools that are just really fun to play with. This is a little bit more in the stretch camp, but I'm going to show you some ways in which I've been using these kinds of tools as well. And it's just like once you get comfortable with the other stuff, and you're like, okay, like let's try some new things. I'll show you just briefly what some of those new things might be. All right. So what does this look like? What an excellent question. Who wrote that? What does this look like? So let's focus on Google Docs for a moment, and let me share with you an example of what I'm talking about. And again, this is not meant to blow your mind. This is meant to kind of show you how much you already probably intuit, and it's just trying to like fortify that intuition that you likely have. So before I switch this slide, commonly what you see with Google Docs is you'll see, especially with Google Classroom, which is in very great like wide use internationally now, is teachers will create assignments and share them with other students, or they'll share a doc that it might have a title on it or have some basic info, and they'll kind of share this open doc, relatively blank document with students. And I've found that to be actually like that's the Achilles heel of using something like simple as a Google Doc with students. What we need to do is we need to do more to control that space in a good way, to help ensure that students know exactly kind of what's expected, in order to make their work more efficient and also teachers' own. So here's a sample of what I'm talking about, because that was all sort of abstracty. There you go. So here's an example. This is an assignment I used with, these were pre-service teachers or in-service teachers, I forget. But let me break it down for you just a little bit in terms of what you're looking at. If it's useful too, let me do this real quick. I think I can chat to everybody. Let me take the link. And let me give you the link so you can also look at it, because it might be small depending on the screen you're looking at. Is that fair to say? I see some heads nodding. All right. So this will go out to everybody, everyone in meeting. Okay, I'm sending the link to the doc I'm looking at now. So you can either look at it on the screen or you can click on it. It should be open. Let me know. And you got a thumbs up. Thank you so much. Who was that who gave me that thumbs up? I can't see your name, but thank you. Blue t-shirt, dark blue collar. Thank you. All right. So there's what we're looking at. So there's like 4 things when creating any assignment with the Google Docs or with Microsoft, whatever you're using. And these are the 4 big things. So one is use tables within the doc. Insert table. And what that does is that creates like a very structured space where it's clear like where students are putting what. So in this document you're looking at now, I'm showing there are actually there's like 3 or 4 different tables on here that I've used, right? But if you'll notice, like it's very clear where the student's name goes. It's going into a box. Like it's going into a box that I've created for that because I inserted the table. So this table at the top with the heading, that's got 1, 2, 3, 4. It's got 4 columns and 2 rows. And then I've labeled things. And then what I do in just this subtle little way is I'll change the color of it so it's like a lighter gray, which is like it's an aesthetic thing, but it's like less jolting, right? It kind of like it makes it a little more subtle. So I never ever you'll see this even in the doc that you're on right now for the webinar. Like I never use a table. I'll never use a doc a Google Doc that doesn't have a table in it, and that I haven't put some forethought in terms of like, what am I asking students to do in this, and where am I providing the clarity and the space in terms of how they're going to work. So part of that is to include really clear instructions. And it's probably, again, meaning what I've observed with teachers in Google Classroom, for instance. Google Classroom, I have a love-hate relationship with it. And my love is that it's super simple, it's clean, like it works well in most ways. But it actually, if there's hate, maybe not hate, I'll come up with a better word. But it's that it actually wasn't designed to be like an online learning tool. It was meant to be a blended learning tool. Like it's called Google Classroom. It was meant to be used in the classroom by teachers. Like that's the point, is that you're supposed to be able to like deepen and expand the work you're doing in the classroom with the tool. So now that everybody's using it for online, you start to see some of the places where that starts to come out and become problematic. One is that the way in which you create assignments for students it can be very unclear sometimes in terms of like, how are students experiencing this assignment? Is it clear how they're handing it in? What I'm asking for? What happens when they copy the document? Did I create the right kind of document for this? How many people have taught in Google Classroom and created something that students can't write into, right? And thank you very much. I don't have your name either, but thank you. But it's total. I've done it. Like I've done it too. So the point though is like with something like instructions, you want to also like put it on the doc as well. Right? Don't just assume that, I created my assignment in Classroom and now, they know what it's about. I'm just going to give them a doc to go do it in. It's like, no, like use tables and then put those instructions in there again. Okay. Number 3, label things. I wrote thins. You can label thins too, wheat thins, whatever you might like, but we'll label things and pre-populate. Okay. And here's what I mean here. It's in the center of that document. So I might have written an assignment already. In fact, I did in the syllabus for this class that was like, here's your question. How do you create a rich rubric that serves an assessment, blah, 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 blah. And then I have these different texts that I wanted students to look at, right? I might have listed all of this stuff in the assignment itself, but it's like, it's a leap for a student to go from the assignment to like doing it. So if you've posted it one place, in my case in a syllabus, and probably in Google Classroom too, but then they leap into this document, and it's like you're asking a lot of any human being to remember all of that stuff in any sort of like context. This isn't even about kids. It's just like you're any human being. Like, okay, so use your table and to label things like these are the texts, and I'm asking you to do a summary in 1 to 2 sentences, and I want textual evidence. That's what I want. Now, here's the thing though too. This is as much for my sanity and efficiency as it is for students. It's way quicker for me to assess this because I've said put it here. It's way quicker for me to assess this because I've said 1 to 2 sentences. You know what I'm saying? Like those little moves that you put together leading up to this kind of assignment, those little moves really, really pay off in terms of your own efficiency. Again, you'll notice even below where it's like based on your completion of the above material, tell me in 4 to 6 tight sentences, and I put the question, right? Like it's giving room for real thinking, but it's not giving room for real rambling. Like I want it to be efficient, I want it to be focused, and like let's get at this. I like to say like you don't have to drink the whole bottle of wine to know if it's a good bottle. You know what I'm saying? Like a sip is fine. All I need is a sentence or two. I don't need the whole thing. The other thing I want to point out about this, and I'll show you another quick example as well, and then we can also look at the rubric. But the other thing I would point out about this is once you design this kind of assignment once, if you do it well, all you have to do is swap out the texts, swap out the question. You know what I'm saying? You could have like 2, 3, 4, 5 of these. If you've got some friends who want to do it together, everyone could design one and just share them. But if you design this kind of assessment well, using these principles to start, like you're not reinventing the wheel constantly. You could call this, well, I'm going to call this my my text summary and textual evidence assignment. And you just use this, not every assignment, but like you've got one of these you throw into every unit, a couple times a unit, right? You can come up with other versions of it. There could be, there's a whole host of other ways you could do it, but the principles are all kind of in place. But once you do it once, you can, if you do it well, you can get a lot of mileage out of it. I also always recommend trying to include a rubric as well, again, for student sanity and for your own. Even if you've got a rubric some other way, even if you do it, like I feel like you can only assess what you've taught, and this reminds you of that relationship between what you've taught and what you're assessing, and it also makes it really transparent to students what they're being assessed on. This is not the assessment rubric below. I would not call a particularly good rubric. This is what I call like a down and dirty rubric, like Tom's late for something and is trying to get a rubric that is somewhat presentable in place. There's other ones in the next assignment I'll show you, I think has a better rubric. But these are the main components. Is that all making sense? Some nods, some thumbs ups if you got them. Yeah? A lot of video off, which is okay, no problem. I respect that. So let's keep going. Here is just another example. This is from a middle school ELA class. I was doing some literacy and tech coaching at a school, and this was an assignment we came up with. So in the main kind of assignment they were interested in that the city had kind of had in their curriculum was called a reader response journal entry. And there wasn't a lot of guidance in terms of what that actually meant. And reader response is one of those things that can get, like, it can be really powerful and it can be done really poorly. So we wanted to try to make sure that there was like some form and some quality behind it. So again, what you'll see here are the four principles I just described. Let me give you the direct link to that because it seemed like some folks appreciated it. So pardon me for just doing it this way. Thank you. And we'll come up here, add it to the chat to everybody. All right. And here's the direct link if you want to see it. In both cases, you are welcome to copy the assignment if it's helpful. That's no problem. Even with the school that I worked with here, everyone was on the same page that if this can be of use to people, go for it. So especially with creating the tables and stuff for the first time, it can feel a little overwhelming maybe. So you could just copy that one I just shared with you from my own class, copy it, use it, no problem. So with this assignment, there's a few things. There's the table, that should be a table. I might have gotten rid of the gray lines, but that should be a table up there. You'll see the other, even with the box for the description below or for the prompt, you see that box below? That's a table with one cell. But it's like I'm putting the prompt in like a very clear dedicated space. It's also how our state exams tend to put the prompts is in some sort of like call out box like that. I've got my instructions again, and then you've got a rubric. These rubrics are better and everything's kind of clearly labeled. I would argue these rubrics are way better for a few different reasons. One is the school really wanted to emphasize standards alignment with Common Core. And so we put that front and center to make sure that everybody was clear in terms of that. Whether or not I agreed that that was the best way to do it, like I understand that was the reality they were dealing with, so we put it front and center. But then what we did is we said, okay, for a student who's answering this prompt, let's have 4 levels. Let's go from like 1 to 4, and let's go from good start, great job, excellent, phenomenal. But then for each one of those things, oops, that was anticlimactic. For each one of those things, what I did then is I worked with the lead teacher to say, if a student is doing a good start, like, actually, I'm sorry, we started over at phenomenal. If a student's doing this phenomenally at like close to grade level, let's say, or beyond grade level, I should say, then like, what does it look like? And she had to describe it. And we looked at some student writing. And it wasn't about saying what they haven't done. It's about saying, like, what are you observing the student doing? So it's you use your annotations to write a comparison of how 2 different characters responded to the same major event in the text. It could have gotten even more specific, but it's this, what we call, like, it's an affirming statement. It's an affirmative statement. And then we said, okay, like, let's jump back now to the good start. What's a student doing? What are you observing if a student's like, they're really just at the beginning of trying to like do this? And it could be that a student's sitting there not doing a damn thing, right? So how do you describe that in a way that honors the potential of their learning? And it's not saying no, it's what do you see? And it says, you explain to me or briefly write about the main character, who the main characters are in the text, and the gist of the plot. So essentially, like, a teacher could come by a desk and a student could be checked out, and like they could be at a good start on 1 if what they do is just engage in a brief conversation, a sentence or 2 about the reading. Does that make sense? Like, it's giving you an affirming place to start. And then what we did is we came up with descriptions for what those 2 middle would look like. One of the things that you'll see is that for great job, excellent, phenomenal, you can't move beyond without saying you use your annotations too. we did that on purpose. Every one of the descriptions for levels 2, 3, and 4, essentially saying like, you need to annotate your text, right? So for that student who started over in Good Start with just giving you a sentence or two, they're not moving on beyond until they're engaging with some of those core annotation activities that were so important in this school setting. But again, what you'll also see here is a few things. You'll see those 4 principles at play. Yeah. What you'll also see is you'll see that this assignment can be you can keep that prompt, which we did, and then you plug in different questions into the italicized box there. The rubrics did change for each one because of the scope of the work we were trying to do. All right. Just a reminder, if you haven't been over on the workshop doc in a while and you want to jot down some of the things that are popping for you, I see a lot of folks are on video. You've got pens going. You look like you've got, that's great. If you have been capturing stuff on the shared doc, we'll check in over there. How popular is it? No, we've all got other methods. That's okay. My thoughts on Canva, I will come to in a little bit. Thanks. Is it Danny? Thank you so much. I'm happy to share some of that in just a little bit. It's okay to use this if you want to. If you have other methods, that's fine too. No problem. Let's keep moving.
I have a quick question.
Yeah, please.
So
Melissa. Hi, Melissa.
Hi. You're labeling of your documents that you would upload into Google Classroom. Mm-hmm. I see that you're using like numerics, reader response journal number 3. Mm-hmm. Do you continue to use numerically? Do you put dates in? Last time I teach on a block schedule, so oftentimes there's more than one thing posted on Google Classroom, yep. and I'm trying to organize that in the spring was far harder than I felt like it should have been.
Yeah.
To keep the kids on track with what they needed to complete and what was what, basically.
Yeah. So that's a great question. Thank you. So in this it's labeled this way because at this school this made sense to the folks I was working with. When I've done my own classes, the issue that I have found sometimes is that when you're looking at lots of assignments in Google Classroom, depending on where you're looking at them and how, their dates, like the dates submitted and other kinds of information is going to be in the mix. And so it can get very confusing. One of the labeling practices that I've seen to be most useful probably is just to say, like, if you've got 4 main units throughout the year, and then within each unit you've got and then you have these 3 core assignments or whatever it might be, like use that and put it at the start or the end, whichever you prefer, but like put that in the label. So if it's unit 2, module 3, assignment 5, whatever, like use that, and that can help make things a bit clearer. But yes, I do think you want to be thoughtful about like the label that you have at the top of the doc should match the label that the students see in Google Classroom, which will help you manage the assignments when you're looking at the grade book as well and knowing where things are.
Okay, so to piggyback off of that, when you post an assignment in Google Classroom, so if I had, I'm teaching on Wednesday, May 1st.
Yep.
Do you suggest posting 2 assignments under one post, or do you do individual post for each individual assignment? My
preference, I like neat and tidy rows. So I would do individual for different assignments. I also and again, it's not just, I was going to say how like students can be, but it's not even students, just human beings. Like if you have multiple attachments and you're asking them to do multiple things, it can just get confusing. It's too easy for some students to miss stuff. So if you're asking somebody, if you're asking them for information, you give them a doc with text boxes where it's like showing it has a cell for where to put it. If you're asking them to submit an assignment, do them the favor of like, and this is my preference, others might disagree, but do them the favor of like giving them separate assignments for anything that you're actually collecting, because on their end, that gives them a better chance of seeing it come up in it could be their to-dos or in their calendars. Like they have all of this whole back end that they see as well. So I've seen teachers too sometimes not realize that you have to create assignments out of anything that, like, if you really want to grade it or you want it in any sort of way, like it should be an assignment, right? Because otherwise it won't pop up with a due date, because it won't pop up on the student's calendar a certain way if it's not put in the system correctly.
Right. And then my last one, I promise.
All right.
It's still the same thing. Okay, so then if you're attaching a text, right, you're reading a text and you're giving them a digital form of that text.
Yeah.
You include that text in every single post.
So give me an example. So like you're teaching.
So I'm asking them to find textual evidence from chapter 3 of Mice and Men about Lenny and his relationship.
Yep.
Okay, Lenny and George's relationship.
Yep.
am I continuously posting that digital text for them to access, or am I posting it one time and then they just have to go back and find that?
Yeah. To post it one time, then there's a couple things you can do. One, if it's a digital text that they can access, then you could just give them the link in the post every time. Like, that's fine. Or if you posted it once at the start of the unit or whatever it might be, then you should be able to copy a link to that post with the text. You can also just put that in. I've done it both ways. Okay, you're welcome. No problem. All right.
I've unmuted myself.
Okay, thanks, Sandy.
I see a couple questions here that I'm just going to give you a few, and then maybe that would also spark some other people to ask questions too.
Okay.
So one of the first ones I got was, what are your thoughts on Canvas?
Yeah. Is it Canvas or Canva?
Canvas.
So the learning management system, not the graphic design tool. So if it's Canvas, it's an LMS. I was going to say it's a learning management system. It's a formal learning management system. Remember, again, Google Classroom isn't. Google Classroom is a blended learning tool, and I think they're ramping it up as quickly as they can to be more official learning management system. So learning management systems are like Canvas, Blackboard, Desire to Learn, or Brightspace, Coursera. These are formal learning management systems, and the reason that matters is because they're designed with complete remote instruction and learning in mind to start. They're designed with analytics that makes it really easy for people to see who's logged in and who hasn't. How much have they completed of this, and this. Anybody who's taught in Google Classroom will know that, like, depending on how your school has installed it and who's in charge of, well, you can't actually see a lot of that basic information very easily. And so Canvas, as far as learning management systems go, like, it's solid. Like, you can do a lot with it. But what I would also say with any learning management system is, like, it doesn't preclude you using things like Google Classroom or Google Docs. So my one bit of advice there for any LMS that you're using would be to always think of this work in terms of layers. And, like, when it comes to an LMS, the LMS is the foundational, like, learning environment and layer. So everything should come through there. But it means, like, if you're using a video from Khan Academy, like, you should embed it into Canvas, but not just rely on the whatever the basic kinds of resources they might have in Canvas. Like, go out, get stuff, but then make sure it comes back in. If you're using Google Docs as, like, for an assignment, let's say, then similarly, like, link to or embed that into Canvas so that you create for users, you're creating a sense of a single learning environment that still uses tools that are associated with like other places.
So that connects to another question that I've got several related to Schoolology. And, like, how would that connect? And many people have written in, they use Schoolology as well. So could you talk more about that connection?
Yeah, I'm less familiar with Schoolology than I am with Canvas, and I am with other LMSs. That's mostly just because schools in New York City, by and large, haven't been using it, and that's where I've been doing most of my work. What I do know from having worked with a lot of different LMSs, and if there are additional questions or things that come up, or if there's screenshots of things, for example, too, that you want to share during this, I'm also happy to look at them. What I do know is that the main challenges around any learning management system tends to be first getting oriented in terms of, like, what do they call units or courses or modules or lessons? What are the different ways in which I can put different kinds of learning experiences or activities together in this and getting a sense of that? And then it's understanding how to embed and pull in things from the outside in a way that's coherent for students. It doesn't result in a lot of, like, drama. Even just linking out to something that a student has to log into separately can be a deal breaker for some students, right? So it's like trying to figure out how to mitigate that. The jolting between different platforms is important. The other thing, too, that sometimes teachers don't appreciate enough about the LMSs is, like, spending not as much time, but spending some quality time understanding the way reporting works, the way defaults in the gradebooks work, and understanding how you can leverage some of the analytics and proactively reach out to students who might be slowing down or not engaged. Like, knowing what engagement looks like in an LMS can be really challenging as well sometimes. So basics of, like, login is a great place to start. When's the last time the student accessed? If Schoology gives, for example, a sense of, like, they might have an engagement meter, not just like when did they log in, but, like, how much have they completed X, Y, or Z. Putting on your calendar as a teacher, periodic, like, twice a week, I'm going to check in on, like, engagement, and just essentially you have something resembling a spreadsheet that you're filtering by, who's the lowest in terms of engagement here. And then you're checking the boxes. Again, these are functionalities that are in most LMSs I've ever worked with in. You check the boxes of the students who are not engaged or haven't accessed. You send out an email to everybody, and it says, good morning, I've noticed that, ... And you proactively get that out there. That's a really, really, really important at the start of any new learning experience or course or class with students. It's so important in the beginning, especially, to let students know that you are there. Their fear is that they're in this alone, and that their teacher's going to phone it in. Like, that's their fear. And so going out of your way at the beginning to make sure that, like, with every one of those students you're responsible for, I know that they are either engaged or I've made direct contact with them and there's a communication line open.
I definitely use the engagement feature, and I think that that's important no matter what age level. I have another question about your thoughts related to Kami, Kami. I'm not familiar with that one.
Anderson.
And Google Read and Write.
So Kami, I'm unfamiliar. And these are tools. If you've got tools and you've got burning questions or not sure what to do with it, I'll give you my contact information too. So any of this stuff that I'm not sure I know enough about, you can also, if you send me links to things after this, I'm also happy to check it out and give you some ideas, some thoughts. And you said Google Read and Write? Mm-hmm. So I'm unfamiliar with that too. So tell me what that is.
Anybody?
I can also just do this. Google Read and Write. So let's see, this one over here, is this what we're talking about? It's an extension and it allows you to, cool. Nice. Learning with you, hold up. Yeah, smart, yes.
And I think that part of this question was also connecting those to the idea of special ed or English language learners.
Yep.
So if you even want to just talk about that too, that also maybe help someone else.
Yeah, that's great. Thanks. So as you see, I have Google Read and Write up here. And it's got some really smart features I'd be totally down to explore. Like, I think it's a good use of time to get a sense of, like, how does this help some of my students learn? It's making different kinds of just kind of supplemental literacy and kind of multi-literacy practices easier to access within the context of Google. So I think that's all a good thing. I think the idea of using, like they're showing here, like using different kinds of images and graphics, so blending the visual with the written is a best practice for English language learners and for students with special learning needs. It works for all students to try to intentionally reinforce what's being conveyed in one mode. So the written mode, reinforcing it with something as well in terms of visual. So I think also what you will find, again, for students with special learning needs and also for English language learners, some of those tips I gave you before about, like, use tables, reinforce your directions, right? Label stuff, like all of that is also really, really helpful for learners for whom a blank document is absolutely horrifying. So I think that's a lot of these practices actually can translate quite well. The other thing, though, that I would add, especially for those populations, but again, not exclusively for those populations, is screencasting, actually. So I want to spend a moment just sharing what I mean by screencasting and really implore you to, if you haven't explored how to use it, to give yourself a half hour to, like, play with it. So what screencasting refers to is where, this is one, again, from a course I taught, I think last year. Screencasting just refers to, like, recording on my screen what's going on and then narrating, as well. The several not free or close to free providers now also make it easy to put your picture, like your video, at the same time. And there's so many advantages to it. So one is that I give screencasting tours for everything as much as I can. And what I mean by that is, like, if I'm starting a class with students, especially if it's remote, I create a screencast that would start on my school website, not even logged into the system, and be like, hey, everyone, welcome to English Lit with Dr. Lynch. we're going to have a lot of fun this semester, but let me show you how to even get into the environment, right? I don't assume that anybody knows with confidence how to like just get in naturally or anything like that. I take them through everything. Here's how you log in. Along the way, it's me. I'm doing this, blah, 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 blah. And once you get into the system, it's a great. Now, just like you would with your classroom, like here's how I've organized the space that we're using for our course this quarter, this semester, whatever it might be, this year. So as you'll see, all your assignments are going to come in over here on the left where I've labeled them assignments. And when you get an assignment, if I click on the sample one here, you'll see something like this. Does that make sense? Like I show as much as I can to demystify this very unnatural learning environment of the like learning management system or Google Classroom or whatever it can be. And I take them and I start outside of the system so that students can feel confident and parents can watch too if they're supporting them at home. The next key thing I try to do with screencasting then, well, let me actually pause for a second. That was just an orientation. If I give an assignment, I try to create a screencast for the assignment. If it's an important one, I'll be like, you know, this is our quarter final essay for Hamlet. This is just a 3-minute screencast. They don't have to be long at all. But it's like, this is my 2 or 3 minutes where I'm just going to walk you through the assignment and make sure it's really clear, like what the parts are, what you need to do and why. The same way I would explain it for a few minutes in the classroom, I'll make a little video of it. And I'll send that out there as well. Next is, if you can, then you try to teach students to create screencasts as well. And there's a whole host of reasons like to do that. The same way that you might use screencasting to create a tour of your cloud learning environment, you could use a screencast in order to demonstrate a skill, or you could use a screencast to walk students through an assignment. I've used screencasting for grading. So I'm not giving you written feedback. I'm looking at your paper with you online in Google Classroom, and I'm talking to you about what I see going on, and I'm sending you a 2-minute video of very specific tailored feedback just to you and your assignment. Once you have those practices and you feel comfortable with them yourself, try to pass the baton to students. So now, you know, in addition to getting, let's say, a traditional, again, literary criticism essay or whatever it might be, whatever kind of thing you might get, in addition to getting that written assignment, you can ask students to create a screencast where they walk you through it. Explain to me what you did here. I can see it. I want to hear from you. Like, why did you, tell me about something that you were really confident about with this assignment. Tell me where you think you struggled. What's the sentence in this paper that you're giving me that you're most proud of? Explain that to me. Which sentence gave you the hardest time as a writer? Which gave you the hardest time as a reader? You know what I'm saying? But the point is to, like, you can have some of those traditional forms of assessments, but when you ask students to create screencasts and to send them in with you, with the assignment, it gives you this whole other level to what they're learning, and it makes grading quicker. Because now as they're explaining it, you're skimming through the assignment, you know what you're looking for, you've done this thousands of times. Like, it adds this whole other level to the assessment experience. There's a really easy way to do that too. At the top, so just like we did with assignments before, where you can envision you have let's say a Google Doc, and you have your heading and you have the tables, you've done these things, Tom's like, oh, do these 4 things, I've done these. You might add to the top of it a text box that just says, with the table, right? And it just says, your screencast link. So they're submitting like the Google Doc as they traditionally would in like Google Classroom, let's say. And again, this can also be in any LMS. They're submitting the assignment, but at the top of it is a place where you've asked them to paste the link to their screencast where they walk you through the assignment. And then you still have everything in one place. You click on the link, and then you're looking at it. It's opened up another tab in your browser, and you're hearing them explain it to you as well. There's also a really great example of a math teacher in California who's created, for years now, he's had his math students, 6th grade math students, 7th grade math students, create skill libraries using screencasting. So what he has is he's got this whole database now, a website that's just, you can look up Pythagorean theorem, and you can hear a 7th grader, an 8th grader, a 6th grader explaining it in their little screencasts. So once you empower students to actually create these as well, there's so many creative ways that you can start to use it. And some of them can be very fundamental and very useful to the whole community. Like, we're going to create, this quarter, we're going to create writing skill videos for each other using screencasting. And once one set of students does it, you actually have it forever, right? So you could continue to use them, or it could be something that gets refreshed every year. But it's called mathtrain.tv. And if you get a little time and want to see it in a math context, I'm sure you can imagine very quickly the kinds of English and literary skills that it would apply to. The main screencasting software that I encourage schools to use, especially if you're using, if you're a Chrome-based school, so you have Chromebooks mostly, or you're using Chrome browsers, is called Screencastify. And Screencastify plugs right into Google Chrome. It syncs up really elegantly with Google Classroom and Google Drive, and I think they give you up to 5 minutes for free, which you can do a lot in 5 minutes. None of these have to be long screencasts at all, and there's a license then that schools can purchase, or you can purchase individually, but that's really good. The other one that I've used is called Screencast-O-Matic. It's a little less easy to use, but like you get a lot for free. And there's tons of other ones that are just coming online all the time. And if you're looking for them, just look under screencasting, free screencasting, and that you'll see tons of options. Let me just show you, we have only 7 minutes, so let me just give you a quick kind of landing the plane sort of thing. And then let's hear some other questions too before we go. So one of the things I've suggested too is that there's ways too that we can kind of stretch and play in the classroom. And one of the main things that I've been doing for the last number of years has been around trying to look for ways to embed computer science into English language classrooms, and trying to do that in a way that's not kitschy, right? Everybody's like, oh, it's computer science, it's CS, so it's a good thing. It's like, no, it's actually probably a total waste of time and money if you're not using it in a way that deepens and expands the core of learning and teaching. That's how I feel about it. That's how I've written about it. And here's an example of some of the things that I've done with English teachers that I'll give you some resources for if it's of any use later on. It's all digitized already. So here's an example of where this is like a very traditional kind of like essay assignment. So your task is to compose an essay about Romeo and Juliet. And about specifically the question is, how does Shakespeare portray the relationship between love and death in Romeo and Juliet? So it's not the greatest question in the world, but it's like middle of the road kind of English class question. Okay, I get it. But what's different about it is I provide students with quantitative data as well as qualitative data about Romeo and Juliet. So what I provide them is I give them a list of the frequencies of the word love and death in every act and scene in Romeo and Juliet. And I ask them to put on a graph, like plot those two words and let's see how they interact. And then I give them an excerpt, a textual excerpt, a qualitative evidence I call it, that is from one of those interesting scenes, and I ask them to make meaning of that. How is Shakespeare portraying the relationship between love and death based on both the quantitative data and the qualitative data? And the results can be really interesting. So let me just walk you through some. This is the rest of the data. This is an example of like a worksheet that I've used in some different workshops. So love is plotted with the hearts and the death is plotted in X's. I had a skull and crossbones at one point, and I think it freaked people out, so I went to X's. And what you'll see when you actually plot them is you get something like this. And so if you're looking at this graph with your students, you'll see that the x-axis is acts 1 through 5 for every scene, and the y-axis is just the number of times the words are used. In workshops, what teachers have pointed out will be that, so love is used a lot in the beginning, and then love is like hardly used at all at the end. That makes sense. It's Romeo and Juliet. But what's also interesting is like they'll point out that like once you get to Act 3, love and death start to get really, in terms of just their word frequencies, it's getting really muddy, right? Which makes total sense. Like in most Shakespearean plays, Act 3 is where all the interesting stuff happens, right? And then if you look over at Act 5, what folks have pointed out is like actually in 4 and 5 that love is that word hardly appears at all throughout those two acts. But when you get to the final scene in the play, you see the word love start to be used more frequently again. And so all of this is to say that like, is this alone enough like for like having read and understood and interpreted literature? No. But if you pair something like this with a qualitative excerpt, or you ask students to use this kind of thinking in order to find other interesting places in the text to reread and to explore, then you can get some really interesting results. So this is an anonymized example, for instance, where a participant in a workshop points out that like Shakespeare's use of the word love plummets on average from an average of over 10 times per scene in the first act to just 3 times in Act 3 when Tybalt slays Mercutio. The near disappearance of the word quantitatively forecasts Romeo's internal struggle to reconcile the death of his friend with his love of Juliet. The point though is to say that like there are a lot of playful ways if we expand the way we're thinking about teaching literature. There are playful ways that we can look computationally at texts that one might be interesting for just you as teachers, right? But also might provide some new access points for students who might struggle with language initially, but could actually look at a graph or look at a chart or look quantitatively at a text. And I think too that the kinds of analyses you can do, I think, can be richer and can be rooted in just more kinds of evidence. There's a free tool online too that you can use called Voyant Tools. It's freely available. And you can take any text and you can copy it into Voyant Tools, and it will do this for you in about 5 seconds. The limitation of it is that it's only going to show you, see that x-axis on that line graph, it's only going to show you 1 through 10, because as smart as computers are, they can't actually very easily break down a text into like chapters or scenes or things like that. It actually takes a lot of human intervention to do that well. But it will show you patterns over the period of the entire text. So if you're interested in any of this kind of stuff, those are some of the links. You can find all of it on my website at tomliamlynch.com. You can also just type in tll.fyi and it'll take you to the website. I've got a couple of recent posts. One is called Red Sheets instead of Spreadsheets, and it looks at doing this for a bunch of Shakespeare plays. And so I have spreadsheets with word frequencies for a whole bunch of Shakespeare's plays that are freely available, and you can take them and play. I also did it for The Great Gatsby, if you're teaching Great Gatsby, just because I love that book. And then you could look up, these are some of the other resources that I've mentioned. We're getting close to the end. We did answer some questions in the middle.
I do have a couple questions I wanted to get to.
Yep.
I lost the chat feature, so I'm sorry. I now know to save the chat if I lose power.
Okay.
But we had a question about small group conversations, and a couple people recommended breakout rooms, of course. But like, what do you think about encouraging people to have more small group conversations and literature-rich discussions?
Totally, like 100%. But they also have to be like scaffolded really well, and students often need, at different age levels, they need reminders of like what it means to have a productive conversation with other human beings, and what does it mean to have a rich conversation about literature in particular. What does it mean to root your discussion like in the text? So there's a lot of ways you can do it. If you're using Zoom or some of the other products, they have the breakout rooms. You can do that. But don't forego, like you would in class, like if you're using accountable talk or you have other protocols for how we have these discussions about texts, make sure you reiterate them. Don't assume that it's just, the students will know. And at the beginning, you have to play like quality cop a little bit, so it's about either whether it's popping into rooms, or you can also make it up on Google, even just with Google Docs. You can create docs for groups of people with tables that have their names. You know what I'm saying? Like you can do some of that. And they can do some of the asynchronous discussion stuff in something like even Google Doc if you wanted. If you're not comfortable with the discussion boards, you don't have some of these other things. But no matter what you do, you want to draw lines on the road, and then make sure that folks are like that they're doing those subtle things in the beginning, honoring what they're hearing from others, posing questions, pointing to the text with specific page numbers. Like you've got to make sure that is the culture of what's happening within those breakout groups, regardless of whether they're happening synchronously or asynchronously, digitally or analog. If you're interested in anything else that I've mentioned, again, a lot of it's on my website, tll.fyi. We'll get you there. I have a newsletter there. I will send a newsletter out later this week with a recap of some of this. So if that's something that you want with like links or things like that, that's you can get it that way. Might be the easiest. I wrote a book a few years ago that's a collection of some essays that I wrote. I was a column editor for English journals, for NCTE's English Journal. And I wrote many columns about the relationship between technology, education, especially teaching English. And I've collected my favorites of those into this it's a slim volume, but it's got tons of pieces written with my professor hat on and English teaching hat on, called Strata and Bones. And I'm just really, really grateful that you've invited me here today, and that I've had a chance just to engage a bit. So thanks so much. And if you want answers to any questions, you can also reach me at any of these places, and I'm happy to try to be as much help as I can.
Thank you so much.
Thanks.
I do believe our session is officially over at 12:30, so we're a little bit over time, but I don't know that another one doesn't start until 1. So I could do a couple more questions if you would like, or you can go ahead and move on to your next session. So that's up to you.
I'm happy to hang. I'm happy to hang for like another like 10 minutes if that's useful.
Sure. I did have one question about supporting students online while teaching in the classroom. I think a lot of people, especially with the way our school system's configured right now, you would have half the class in class while you're doing online activities with the other half of the class.
Yeah.
So do you have any ideas about how you would do that effectively? I think that would be an important question if
yeah.
we only get a few.
Yes. And then this is going to vary school district by school district. And then depending on what happens in the first 4 weeks of school, there could be a total other like change in the road. So what I've been talking with different school leaders about has been focus on like what it means to create, like to focus on blended learning. Like, so focus on assignment, like, so essentially like creating assignments, creating materials that are as digital as possible. And having a sense of like, if it's in face-to-face, then we dial it this way. And if it's online, I dial it that way. But it's like not doing everything you can to resist the urge to design 2 different curricula or to do things 2 totally different ways for the same curricula. And so, for example, some of the things that we've explored, even just in this brief workshop, it's like, well, or presentation, it's like, well, you know, the idea of like, for all of my main assignments or anything I'm going to collect and grade is coming through Google Classroom or whatever we're using. It's coming through the learning management system. It's coming through Canvas, whatever it is. It doesn't matter if I have 12 students in front of me and another 12 are online. All the assignments are coming in this way. That would be one step to do, is to think in terms of blended, and then like what are the ways I adjust this way or that way for face-to-face versus virtual. Other things that could be done is I would definitely get comfortable with screencasts and think about ways that you can make asynchronous the kinds of direct instruction that you might do in the classroom. So if you typically have like, you know, that fantastic poetry annotation lesson that you've done, let's say, do a screencast version of it, make it available online for everybody. And then when students are in your room, you're there to help make sure that they're essentially doing the same work in the same sequence that the other half of the class is doing online. The folks who are there with you just have the advantage of like, you're coming around and you're able to like support them in differently. But I wouldn't think about it being a totally different show. Like, the show is online. And then the kinds of support you can get when you're face-to-face is just going to be different than the kinds of support you get if you're online supporting students. I also think there's something to be said for, this is based on a conversation I had with a teacher friend recently, like her concern was that if she's face-to-face with students for X number of hours a day, how is she supposed to also have time to work with the other students who are online? And as much as possible, I've encouraged her to think about like, get over the guilt that you might feel by like answering questions from your online students when you're offline with these other students. Like, you're just, you're in the environment. And so if you're going around to different students while they're in your classroom and everybody's actually working from the same learning management system or the same set of learning experiences that's in Google Classroom, whatever you're using, then if you have 5 minutes in between having checked in with your students face-to-face, then go online and answer some questions or check in on engagement or do that. Like, bring those worlds together and try not to view them as like these 2 totally separate things. And you can do that from a curricular perspective. You can do that from an instructional perspective. And you can also do that just from like an administrative, managerial perspective of like, how do I keep up with all of the information and stuff that's coming? Use your time in the classroom as efficiently as possible. And that means, looking for creative ways to even say at the beginning of a face-to-face class, you might have, like, for the first 7 minutes of class, we're going to make sure that folks are getting started. I'll be over here doing this, and then I'll come around after that time. For the 7 minutes that you're there, you might be using that as protected time to check in with students online or whatever it might be. So as much as possible, it's to try to elegantly blur those worlds. And the first step towards that, I would say, is to treat it as I guess I said a blended class before, and I think the way I described it, though, is actually like you're actually planning an online class that you have a blended option for, and that sometimes you're there with students, and maybe that's a more accurate way to describe it.
I think a lot, you could tell by some of the feedback in the chat that everybody really got a lot out of that question. So
nice.
Thank you very much.
I didn't see that. Thanks for saying that. I see
I've been trying to monitor there and condense some where I could. So does anybody have one last question or anything to follow up that we would like to ask? One more question? All right. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much.
Really appreciate it. And hopefully this went okay for you. Thank you.
Yeah, thanks everyone. Really appreciate it.
Thanks everyone for
coming.
Stay
in touch. Bye.
Thanks, Tom.
Thank you. Bye.
Thank you.
Bye.